So this would be part 2 of issues in Boston, kind of not only leading up to the revolution, but specifically our big event is what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. Now we left off with the fury of protests that followed the passage of what was called the Stamp Act. Recall that there was political protests led by men such as Patrick Henry of the Virginia House of Burgesses. There was violent protest led by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, where they did things like tarring and feathering tax collectors. But above all, there was economic protests, boycotts, economic boycotts. Various merchants in different cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston agreed that they were not going to import British goods. So ultimately, the Stamp Acts were repealed. Now, again, you know that when one tax is repealed, there's probably another one that's coming. And the graphic should give you an idea somewhat as to what's coming next. What we have here are a new series of taxes that are lumped together in the Townshend Acts. Townshend being named for the individual in Parliament who wrote the laws. Now, they are meant to replace the repealed Stamp Act to collect revenue. Remember that revenue is bringing money in. So it's designed to collect revenue for the British government. So we see new, and the emphasis is on small. Remember that smuggling was so common that even though the taxes are small, any tax is more money than the colonials are used to paying. So now we have things like glass, tea, which will become important later on, different paper products, and lead. This is also designed to continue the crackdown on smugglers that began in the immediate aftermath of the French and Indian War. Property. In this case, we're mainly talking the property of merchants, people who use ships to get goods from point A to point B. Property can be seized without due process. Due process means, if a law enforcement official wants to search your property, take your property, confiscate it, they need a reason. They need what's called just cause. A judge needs to sign off on it. They need to okay it. This eliminates that due process. This means if the British think you're a smuggler, just like that, they can take your property. It also is going to legalize what we see here called writs of assistance. See, these days, according to the United States Bill of Rights, Amendment 4, the Fourth Amendment covers what's called search and seizure. This would be where if you're watching any cop shows, there's a knock on the door, the cops present a piece of paper. If you want to search property for something, you need a warrant. You need written justification signed by a judge, which allows you to search property. This was more general. It made it easier to search the property of smugglers like John Hancock. So just like with the Stamp Act, Boston and the Sons of Liberty are going to lead the resistance to the Townshend Acts. Now, Boston in particular, besides the fact that they are seen as inciting violence, they're being punished for a letter that urged all colonials to boycott British goods until all new taxes were repealed. And this makes sense because they just saw that economic boycotts worked. It worked when we protested the Stamp Act. It can work now. New York merchants were on board immediately. Remember, in New York, they were the ones who had the idea to boycott British goods for the Stamp Act. They're on board right away for the Townshend Acts. Philadelphia merchants are going to wait a year before signing on. Merchants in the South, so you can think, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, they never signed on to it. So already we can kind of see that there's friction between northern colonies and southern colonies. British troops were transferred from Halifax to Boston. Halifax is in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. So British troops were transferred from Canada to Boston, and they more or less occupied the city. If you're a Boston citizen, this is what you would see. You would see armed British troops in your streets. So you consider yourself under occupation. And animosity is a way of saying there was tension, there was friction, there was conflict. The Bostonians referred to the British soldiers as lobsterbacks. That was how they insulted them. On the flip side, British troops, when they weren't on duty, when they weren't standing at their post, a lot of them took second jobs. So they competed with Boston citizens for jobs. All of this is going to come to a boil. All right, this friction between the two sides is going to erupt into an event that a silversmith named Paul Revere immortalized with his engraving that was called the Bloody Massacre. But now we know it as the Boston Massacre. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a sentry, meaning a soldier, in front of the custom house in Boston was being taunted by a group of men and boys, calling them lobsterbacks, insulting him. They also pelted this sentry with snowballs, ice, stones, and oyster shells. So they were throwing things at him. And snowballs that have ice in them, that can cause some damage. 8 reinforcements came to the aid of this one soldier, and hundreds of colonials converged on the scene. Shots rang out, and 5 were killed instantly, including a man named Crispus Attucks. Half white, half African-American man, Crispus Attucks, died during all of this. Samuel Adams, the leader of the Sons of Liberty, referred to it as a bloody butchery, and he widely distributed this engraving that, again, Paul Revere made. The following day, Sam Adams' distant cousin, John Adams is a lawyer practicing in Boston. He was asked to defend the soldiers. And this man, Captain Preston, who's depicted here, he was asked to defend the soldiers and Captain Preston, and was told that no one else would. He had a great reputation as a fair lawyer. So the British thought, nobody else will, maybe you can help us. Adams accepted immediately because he believed no man in a free country should be denied the right to trial and counsel, meaning a trial and a lawyer. Now, the trials of Captain Preston and his men were held separately. Remember, this is a jury of Boston citizens that are determining the fate of these men. A jury of Boston citizens, 5 of their fellow Bostonians were killed by these soldiers. Captain Preston was found not guilty. Not guilty. 6 of the soldiers were acquitted. Again, not guilty. 2 of the soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter and had their thumbs branded. Now, manslaughter is a way of saying you did not mean to kill someone, but your actions caused death. So that's the difference between murder and manslaughter. Now, obviously, Adams is not necessarily a popular man. He faced scorn. People didn't like him for defending the British and getting them acquitted. But in the long run, he got respect and prestige. He famously stated, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictums of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." See, John Adams is now on the radar of the higher-ups throughout the colonies. He's an honorable man. He will speak the truth. He will do what is right. Now, truthfully, the only reason that the revolution did not begin immediately after the Boston Massacre was because word arrived that the Townshend Acts had mostly been repealed. So the British troops were there because of resistance to the Townshend Acts. Most of those went away. The only tax that remained was a tax on tea. Now, this bloody massacre, this is a clear example of propaganda. It's the most famous image of the Boston Massacre. It incorrectly shows where it took place. You don't see the customs house anywhere. Captain Preston is shown standing behind his men, raising his sword like he's giving the order to fire. That didn't happen. The citizens were armed with clubs and ropes. They're not holding anything. Crispus Attucks is nowhere to be found. The most famous victim is not depicted. And we know there was at least a foot of snow on the ground in early March. This speaks to the power of propaganda and visual imagery. When this is distributed throughout the colonies, people are mad. They're angry. So there's rumblings. There's rumblings that maybe these separate colonies should have some way of communicating with each other. They need to organize. And that's where the committees of correspondence comes into play. Now you see this thing post-Gaspé incident. The Gaspé was a British ship that was off the coast of Rhode Island searching for smugglers, which this was part of those Townshend Acts. Ships were patrolling the coast, trying to crack down on smuggling. It ran aground. All right, this ship with the unpopular captain ran aground. Colonists burned the ship and were ordered back to England for trial. This goes against the idea of a right to a trial by jury of one's peers. John Adams, in particular, is furious because he already proved in the Boston Massacre trial that even in colonial America, any man, doesn't matter if they're British by birth or colonial by birth, any man can get a fair trial. So this kind of smacked in the face of England is continuing to treat us unfairly and take away our rights. Now, these committees of correspondence were somewhat informal. It was more the well-to-do members of colonial society like Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson. The idea was loose unification. It gave colonials a reason to communicate about the goings-on in different places. And since these are more well-to-do merchants, well-off individuals, like lawyers, men of high esteem, it helped shape public opinion. These colonial leaders understand that it could lead to war. There has been bloodshed in Boston. What's going on is intensifying. We very well could see ourselves leading down the path of war. Great Britain could come at the colonies with more of their mighty military, their army and navy. So with these committees of correspondence, kind of coming on the heels of the Gaspé incident and the Boston Massacre, plans for resistance are now put in place.